Well, we are so excited that you are all here. And it's a pleasure to introduce our next panel. The Frazetta Legacy in Contemporary Fantasy Illustration, honestly, with the first family of fantasy illustrators. So we're going to be talking with Julie Bell, Boris Vallejo, Anthony Palumbo, and David Palumbo. Julie, Boris, Anthony, and David are gifted artists who have been inspired by the notable legacy of fantasy and science fiction illustrator Frank Frazetta. This panel will explore their art, their position in the field, all the work that they've done, their creative and technical approaches, and of course their work has inspired so much acclaim and admiration from their fans. I'm just going to give you a little background on these amazing artists, though their credentials go much longer than we're able to provide here. After becoming a nationally ranked bodybuilder, Julie Bell began a career in illustration, creating advertisements for numerous companies, designing video game packaging art, and working in the comic book industry, where she became the first woman to illustrate Conan the Barbarian for Marvel Comics. Considered one of the masters of modern fantasy illustration, Boris Vallejo has built a tremendous following in the genre of imaginative realism. Over the course of his 50-year career, he has painted nearly every fantasy figure, including Tarzan, John Carter, Conan the Barbarian, Red Sonja, and many more. His most viewed work may be the illustrated film poster for National Lampoon's Vacation, in which he parodies his own barbarian-themed work. Anthony and David Palumbo have been accomplished fantasy artists in their own right. David has built a career creating dramatic works in a classical style, often in the genre of dark fantasy. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, Scientific American, Marvel Comics, and in products for Wizards of the Coast, Blizzard Entertainment, Lucasfilm, and Sideshow Collectibles. Anthony excels in both fantasy illustration and portrait painting. In addition to creating several works for the role-playing game Magic the Gathering, he has created artwork for Dark Horse Comics, Fantasy Flight Games, and Heavy Metal Magazine, among others. During this talk, we're going to run some artwork in the background, and you'll enjoy that during their conversation with Jesse, but please don't hesitate to jump in with questions, and we are so happy that you are all here. So I am actually just going to share my screen. We will put up your amazing work, and Jesse will begin the conversation.
All right, good morning, everybody.
Hey.
Morning.
Hello.
Yeah, I just want to comment that the first time I met Julie and Boris was at IlluxCon 2019, and Julie, we talked over email, but I never met you or anything, but immediately you gave me a hug. You were so welcoming. It was such a terrific moment. And then seeing your work, your work and Boris's work together was just phenomenal. And then David and Anthony, yeah, David and Anthony. I don't think I've met you in person, or
I think we met at that same show.
David, okay,
briefly,
yeah, terrific. Yeah, but yeah, your work is just outstanding. Anthony, unfortunately, the painting you were going to loan was in bad shape, but we will include a painting in the exhibit shortly, so you'll all be included.
Oh,
but,
great.
Yeah. But Boris, I was wondering if you could talk about your early career, learning illustration in Peru and then moving to America, and then how you got started in illustration.
Well, actually, I have to say, when I was in Peru, I wasn't really so much of an illustrator per se. I would do some advertising work and things like that, because my original thinking was that I was going to be a doctor. I was going to study medicine, and I was, as a matter of fact, at the point that I realized that that's not what I wanted to do, I was already, going to the university to study medicine. Now, at that point, one of the art directors that I was doing freelance work for as an artist said to me, you're really wasting your time here. You should go to the United States and you should go to New York City. And when he said that, I went into panic I figured there is no way in the world that I'm going to go to New York City. And, what am I going to do there? I don't know anybody. I don't speak English. What am I going to do? And he said, well,
No, I think we've lost the video feed there.
and I was lucky enough
There we go.
to actually find people that actually rented places in their house. And then I met by accident too, people that actually were connected with illustration and fantasy. So that's how it started.
Terrific. And what were some of your first illustration jobs in the U.S.?
Very good question.
Well, I think,
They
yeah, because you were doing those hardline things first, right?
Yeah.
They weren't fantasy illustrations.
it was advertising work,
Mhm.
so for department stores. So it had nothing to do with illustration per se,
Well,
and
it's
certainly
yeah,
not with fantasy.
Right.
So anyway, it was a good training because it gave me a feeling for really accuracy and, how could I put it, really discipline.
Mhm.
I had to have things done at a certain time. I had to do them, very accurately. And so it was a further development for me.
And what was your first big break? I know you did the Barbarella poster early on. Was that it, or was there something earlier?
And no, I mean, actually, the first break was actually doing comic book covers.
Mhm.
And I didn't get into doing the comic books themselves, but I would do the covers. And I really, really enjoyed very much the fantasy covers. So I was once again, lucky enough to get a job doing that kind of painting. So that's how I started going into the fantasy world.
And Julie, could you tell us about your illustration career, how you got started? I think you went to school for illustration, correct?
I did actually major in, I didn't actually ever finish, college, or I didn't go to an actual art school. I was going to colleges, different colleges, but I was always majoring in fine art and minoring in illustration, which I don't know what that actually means, but I really, what I did in school was really just a bunch of drawing, and I never, like I studied a lot of different art classes of different kinds, but it was always centered on drawing rather than painting. But I always had a real interest in art that was mostly really from the Art Nouveau period, is what I come to realize is where my mind was always attracted to that the most. And I do think that's reflected in my work at this point. But then I had always wanted to, my original thought was that I wanted to illustrate children's books. And so I just, as I went along, I kind of was thinking that that's the way I was going to do things. But then I was also competing in bodybuilding, and I was raising my kids, and it really was like my art for a long time was kind of on the back burner. But I would do pieces of art, and I would still study art during that time a little bit, and I was doing art for private commissions. Like somebody did have me illustrate 2 different children's books. They weren't the kinds of picture books, but it was like novels. And so anyway, until I met Boris, when I met Boris was when I really started being very, like, taking my own art seriously as something that I could really do something with it, and training and bringing my skills up to the professional level and focusing more specifically.
Terrific. Yeah, I have a question here from a viewer. Boris, what inspired your children's book, The Boy Who Saved the Stars?
Well, I'm sorry, well, the question is what?
Yeah, what inspired the children's book, The Boy Who Saved the Stars?
I wish I could tell you. It was, at this point in my life, I have done so much. I have done so many things that it's really almost impossible to remember every detail about every illustration that I did. So it's very embarrassing, I can tell you. But, it's one of those things, that I say, okay, yeah, how did I get into that, So anyway, That's
You
as
can
much
always
as I
make something up. So you had this vision came to you and
can.
The
um,
Martians came in and gave him, yeah.
yeah, and another question here. If all four of you feel free to jump in here, but if you can talk about the difference or the connection between fine art and illustration, if you see a difference, if you think they're the same, or what are your thoughts?
Well, actually, I would say that illustration is supposed to, and it does in so many cases, have more flair. We actually can go really further, with our fantasy that to do with just regular illustration. We do realistic work, but we push it beyond the normal limits.
That makes sense because the point of, I mean, if you're thinking of commercial illustration, the point of it is usually kind of like to sell a product, I guess. I mean, if we're thinking of it that way, like an illustration for a cover of something, it is to sell a product rather than fine art might be just a personal piece of art. I mean, these are terms that, have a lot of judgment behind them and a lot of, people's opinions. So I'm kind of just making my own assumption that by, illustration, that's what you're talking about, but I'd like to hear what Tony and David might have.
Yeah,
to say about that.
I think there's overlap depending on kind of, if you look at, for example, like the way that Norman Rockwell's art was viewed in the time that he was making it and the way it's viewed now. It was done for clients as illustration. I think that's how he saw it, but I think that it's regarded as also being noteworthy outside of just a product illustration. And similarly, so if you want to say that it's just pieces that are done for some kind of like commercial purpose, there's also a lot of pieces in the history of art that might have been commissioned for religious purposes and things like that are not thought of as in the category of illustration. So yeah, I suppose it gets a little murky.
Yeah, no, the Sistine Chapel. Let's talk about that. Huh?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely very murky, and it is interesting what you're saying, David, how over time it becomes when that, original people who commissioned the art, like the Sistine Chapel, when that's not the case anymore, it becomes a whole different thing to the people who see it. So that is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, for contemporary work, I suppose it's really just about kind of how it's presented publicly and if it has any basically like a commercial angle to its creation. I think a lot of people are interested in the story of why something exists, and that plays a big part, more so than like you could look at two pieces that look very similar to each other but have very different reasons as to like how they came about, and people might see them very differently for that reason, even if they were by the same artist.
Very true. And it's so often that, Boris and I have painted things that were for a commission, and we painted it according to what the person who commissioned it wanted, for their purposes. And then people come along later on and ask us, why did we do it that way? And sometimes they object to the way we did it or whatever. And it's like, well, this was not my personal piece. I mean, I do have those too. And I do put my own self in everything I paint. So in that way, it is a certain amount of my own personal work. But when you are fulfilling a client's, you're doing a commission painting, you are working for that person. So to some degree, you're aiming it in their direction.
Well, you aim in that direction, but actually you see it in a certain way yourself.
Yeah.
Each one of us has a very specific way of seeing things that doesn't necessarily have to be, what the next person really see or feels. But, once you are a professional artist and you establish, really yourself, even this to yourself, you do what comes out of your hands and what comes out of your brain. So nothing really abnormal about that.
Anthony, what are your thoughts?
What David said was covered a lot of my thoughts about it, that most of much of the art that we see in the museums around the world now was created in the time before like mechanical replication of images, but that could be thought of as commercial art of its day that now is fine art. And today it's sort of whatever the artist wants to call themselves, and they can be in different modes. Like I can be in fine art mode, and then every day I have to switch to commercial art mode for my job as an illustrator also.
Perfect. Yeah, and,
Back and forth, I like that too.
so Boris and Julie, how did you meet? And Julie, if you could just talk about the beginnings of your illustration career as it exists now.
Well, we
Well-
met because I was competing in bodybuilding, and I had won a contest that was in New Jersey that the owner, or the owner of the gallery that was the sponsor of the contest, told Boris that he should, work with me as a model. And so that's how we met each other. And in the beginning of my
Hopefully they'll come back.
Yeah.
Well, we should say while their video is broken, I don't think it's been mentioned yet that David and I are Julie's sons. So okay,
we got
you guys are back.
Okay, sorry, we got disconnected for a second.
Yeah.
So anyway, I could watch him paint, and I could see a lot of things that were missing from the approach that I was taking in creating a painting, that I wanted to start using, those ways, those methods of working, and just that way of thinking about it. And so I started making some samples of my work, and I could see that I was going to be able to do a lot more than what I used to think I could do. And so the more I did it, it was pretty addictive to me, because the more I did it, the more I realized I could do. And so then when I had a few samples together, actually Boris took me to meet the people at Heavy Metal Magazine. And so I showed them what I had been working on, and right away they took 3 of my paintings as covers, and that was extremely encouraging to me, for that to happen. So it just kind of went from there. And then I started getting video game cover work. I didn't do video game work internally on games, but and also a few things at Marvel with, like you were mentioning, the Conan covers, and then the trading cards that came along after that. That was a really big thing in my career.
Perfect. Hey, Anthony, on the screen we've got Angel Token from Magic the Gathering. Could you talk about this a little bit?
Sure, yeah. That was done a couple of years after I started working for Wizards of the Coast doing magic card paintings. So that was around 2011 or 2010. And I was extremely excited when I got the email for the assignment of paint an angel token, and it just said pretty much I had the freedom to create whatever I wanted. And that exact assignment is what I wanted to do when I first tried to work for Magic. It was like, I hope I get to paint one of the angels, some artwork with an angel, because I love those, the look of those cards. So the card as printed is cropped, just you only see the top half of it, and I knew that's what it was going to show on the card, but I was like, I'm gonna like paint the heck out of this piece, and I wanted to paint the whole figure. So that's why it's so vertical, even though magic cards are usually a box that big.
Perfect. Yeah, so
I love that painting, by the way. I just love it.
Yeah,
It's so good.
perfect. Yeah, so Anthony and David, I'm sorry, I don't know if we said it or not, but you are Julie's sons. And I wondered what effect she has had on your illustration, your careers, your learning process, if she has affected you at all, or if you've just ignored her advice and gone your own way, and I guess what your education has been.
So, some of both, probably. I think that for me, I know they were the both of them. Boris too were also always super supportive, but never heavy-handed in trying to direct us towards art or any other thing. It just happened to be something that Tony and I both had an interest in from really, really young. And I remember getting to go to like life drawing classes when I was still in high school, definitely, maybe even middle school. And at one point, our mom was teaching one of the classes. And so that was really cool to just get to do that. And then when I went away to school to study painting was the first time that I ever really started getting into doing wet media. And it wasn't until like a couple years at school that I think that I actually came and sat down and like started watching the way that they paint and learning from them, which I guess I just needed a little bit of kind of like outside foundation before I could start kind of, you know, understanding their process and how it worked.
Yeah, and I would say that when our mom started working professionally, that was, I was around 9 and Dave was around 7 years old, and that was the first time we ever heard of the concept of a person having the job of doing art and painting. It was not something we thought of as a future path for ourselves, I think, until that moment. And then seeing our mother and Boris at home every day working next to each other on their easels, it just looked like an ideal way to live. And I think that for both of us, that was kind of a future that we hoped we could do something like that also.
Yeah, it took a lot of the doubt out of it. Like if I know, I don't want to speak for Tony. I know for myself that at one point I was interested in getting into doing like special effects for movies or something when I was really young. And, you know, if I had decided to go that way, I don't know the first thing about it, you know? And so the prospect of going into a career field that's highly competitive, as I'm sure that is, and that's really kind of like hard to see how it works from the outside is pretty scary. And so that was also like, yeah, that was just having that example of like seeing that this is a job and understanding how it works was really valuable, I think.
It's interesting what you're saying, because I'm right there with you because really until I met Boris, I did not ever know any person who was a professional, who lived with the money that they made doing their art. They all the artists that I knew were my art teachers, and they weren't really, I mean, some of them did have shows and things like that, but none of them were illustrators. And I always loved illustration. I would look at tons of it in book covers and whatever, or in children's books, but I never understood, how do you get from here to there? It just seemed like such a mysterious world. And it really does make a huge difference if you know, I mean, if you could meet somebody and know that they really exist, and that that field of work really does exist as a real thing. I mean, I think it's got to be a lot better for people now with the internet. You know, you can see people's lives a lot more than you used to, but it really is weird how mysterious that world seemed to me at that time.
Yeah, and David and Anthony, I guess, at what age did you realize, oh my God, my parents are Boris Vallejo and Julie Bell, and they're these superstars in the art world?
For me, it was right the first year that they met, around 1989, when I was 9, and seeing my mom's art all of a sudden on the cover of Heavy Metal magazine at the 7-Eleven down the street from our house. Like, it just happened really fast like that, and it was really exciting.
Yeah, I think it was something that we were aware of, but I think also because it was like a weird age to be like, we didn't always grow up with it, but we were young enough that it also kind of became pretty normal pretty quickly. I think for me anyway, it was just kind of, it was really cool, but also like, just, you know, like, yep, okay, I guess this is what's going on now. So Yeah.
Terrific. I just interviewed Sarah Frazetta, Frank Frazetta's granddaughter, and I know a lot of fantasy artists in the exhibition have talked about Frazetta's influence. And I wondered if Frazetta influenced any of your work.
You're asking all of us.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah, for sure. There is no way, no getting around it.
I can tell you, from
Absolutely.
my side, really, when I was in South America, I had no idea that you could make a living doing art. I mean, yes, sure, you can show in museums, you can show in galleries, but to make a living entirely based on art was totally foreign to me. So what I have to do, when something, an idea is foreign like that, you go to a foreign place.
But when you saw Frazetta's
And
work, that really
That's the
inspired you.
whole thing, I
Yeah.
came to the United States and I didn't know what I was going to be doing, but I did see the work of Frank Frazetta at one point, and I figured this is wonderful. I really, really love what he's doing, and I figured, okay, I'm going to just see if I can get into that kind of a field, and that's how I got the influence, of Frank, and I really just did my thing and made a living from it.
You, the story that I heard was that you were doing this kind of illustration work that was for department stores, where you were just
Right.
doing all these little ink drawings of refrigerators and different products for the stores and furniture and things like that. And you really just got so tired of it, but you had been seeing this work of Frazetta
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
was all these beautiful women and these really muscly men, which you had also
That's
been
the whole
involved
thing,
with bodybuilding.
I was very influenced by bodybuilding myself.
Yeah, and so you had that in your mind of what you just loved that.
Right.
And then at one point you had this enormous job of a bunch of your refrigerator work and stuff to do in one night, and you just really felt like, I just can't take it. I just don't want to do that. And you did this really cool painting of like a harpy and a
That's
barbarian or something like that, and that you did that instead of your work that you were supposed to be doing.
Right. Of the refrigerators, the open refrigerators.
Yeah, right. And that was kind of like the beginning, because then you felt so much passion for that. And then he took it and actually was able to sell that cover for, what was it, Erie magazine or something? I don't
Yeah, I
remember if
believe
it was
so.
Erie.
I think it was, yeah, Warren bought it, right?
Okay, Warren, yeah.
Which they might have been publishing Erie, I don't remember.
Yeah.
Right. Have to remember all this.
Yeah,
David,
I mean, yeah, it's I feel like it's hard to think about what fantasy art would be without Frazetta's work having been part of that evolution. And yeah, it just, to me, it seems so baked in, not even just to illustration and painting, but to movies and to like all kinds of just different visual culture that we grew up with. And so yeah, in addition to admiring like his work as a painter, it also, like, I've heard stories about how he helped to kind of like change some of the practices of like companies keeping the originals. I'm not sure about any of this, but I've heard that he insisted that his originals be returned to him, and that kind of started kind of making that a thing of the past, that companies would just hold on to the artwork.
yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
That's very cool. Wow, I didn't know that. That's cool.
Anthony?
The thing to me about his work is just the flair, just like the power of that flair that he punched in there. It's so good. Just love it.
Yeah, Anthony?
Yeah, he's massively influential on all of us. I think the way he incorporated the figure into his illustration is like fundamental to our families, to the art that we all do. Super inspirational.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. To use a figure and give it the realism, but you have these other things that are just made up, and so you're kind of grounded in a certain amount of realism, and then you're in this fantasy world. So it brings you into that fantasy world, and that incorporation is the cool, tricky part that makes it, where you believe it, like you are in that world.
Mhm. And what are some of your other artistic influences?
Aside from
So
Boris,
it's so great, because you get influence for everything that you see. Just the world by itself is very influential. I tell you, one of the things, we were talking about Frank Frazetta, and one of the things that really, or I would say the thing that mostly really impressed me was the fact that he worked with this sexy, the paintings that he did, he had this sexy women and this very muscular men. And I had been very much into bodybuilding myself when I was in South America. And of course, I'm a man, I like sexy women. And look at my wife. So anyway, that I saw the work of Frank Frazetta, and that was very inspirational to me. Not only, he had this beautiful technique, but he also worked with these models. So it was very inspiring.
yeah,
Yeah, other artists?
I mean, it's I guess there's probably short lists for all of us that just keep expanding the more you start thinking about it. Some for me that come to mind are Leyendecker and Mead Schaefer is like some people representing kind of that like golden age era, NC Wyeth, and then some contemporary people that really inspired me were Sam Weber and Jeremy Geddes, and I mean a ton of people that if I start going, I won't stop. So I'll hand it over to Tony.
yeah. Well, Boris was my first great influence, and then through him, I learned about fantasy art, and then discovered Frazetta and Jeff Jones as well. I think Jeff Jones and Frazetta are like, and Boris are my foundation.
Definitely, of course, my painting technique, I learned from Boris to begin with. I've kind of pushed it in sort of my own direction in more recent years, but so that's a huge, like, #1 influence in my art expression. But other artists who, I've looked at for sure, like I mentioned, the Art Nouveau period of illustration, but also like just the painters from the time, like the symbolist painters I love, and the painters from like the late 1800s into the early, like that time of the early 1900s and late 1800s. A lot of the Eastern European and French people, I just love it. But also I really love Japanese art as well. And and like a contemporary that I always mention just about every time I have any kind of a discussion is Yoshitaka Amano. And the thing I just love about what he does is just the freedom of how he just does whatever he feels like. And it's just, as long as he feels it and it's beautiful, then he does it. And I just love that. So I don't know. I feel like I don't do, my work doesn't look like his, but from him, it makes me feel like I could do what I want to do. So it's kind of cool, and cool, different kind of influence.
Perfect. And what are each of your processes for painting? Do you use models? Do you use photographs? How do you come up with your ideas? Start with David.
I do reference heavily. I'm really interested in photography, and so that's something that has become a big part of my process. A lot of the time, if I'm solving a design problem, I'll think about it photographically in terms of like what kind of lens do I want to use, where do I want to put my camera, and then kind of figure out the scene from there. Because of the pandemic, I've not been able to work with a lot of models this past year, which has kind of accelerated me starting to get more into using 3D tools, which has been something Tony can talk a lot more about that, but it's been really pretty amazing, like how helpful that can be. And yeah, a quick overview of my process is I sketch up thumbnails and then start sourcing and shooting and creating reference and assemble kind of like mashups of that and create little monochrome paintings that are my sketches. If I'm sending something to a client, that's what I show them. And at that point, like everything is very much designed so that when I get notes or when I get approval on that, I can sit down and just get right into doing the finished piece, which I'll, you know, just sit down with, just paint on a board and start getting into it with the mindset of an alla prima style.
And
Yeah,
Anthony?
Dave and I both learned a lot about how to gather your reference material from Boris's technique, seeing how he would have models to do the poses that he conceived of for his sketches, and then he would look through when he needed like a reference of an animal. He would find magazines and clip out pictures, and then it was amazing when the internet came along, because then we could start searching for more reference things and saving files in a computer instead of having giant bookcases full of stuff.
Well, and also just having over time collecting tons of photos from like any place that we go. I'll shoot lots of pictures, and there's stuff that I never intended to be referenced that it's like,
Yeah.
oh, that, you know, these columns in this palace in Venice, that's perfect for what I need here, you know, that kind of stuff.
And when we needed extra help visualizing something, like if I needed to do a realistic painting of a gangster with a Tommy gun sticking out of an old car, I would have, back 15 years ago, I would buy a plastic model kit of the car and photograph it. But now we do use 3D tools to get a model of a car in our computer and have a little virtual studio where we can we're like photographers in that 3D realm, and then we have our reference material, and I used to sculpt like pieces of armor out of Sculpey to use for detail for armor reference, and now I sculpt them in ZBrush and then use that for my reference. And Boris, for that kind of stuff, he always just made those things up out of his head.
While you're saying it, Tony, somebody in the chat just asked, what 3D tools are you using? Tony does 3D more than any of us, so.
I think ZBrush is the uniquely essential one. And as far as having somewhere to do renders and set up cameras, all of the software, the major ones, are equally good. It just depends on your specific needs, but I like to use Maya.
And then Mom and Boris, what's your process?
No, the process for me is actually second nature at this point. I have to say that I find it very, very interesting to hear, you know, how Tony and David and Julie, you know, describe what they do and how they do it and how they get their ideas and so on and so forth, you know. At this point in my life, I have to say it just happens.
Well, how do you start a painting? Let's just get down to fundamentals. Like, what do you do first?
Well, the first thing that I do is I do a pencil sketch. Basically, you know, often enough, I would say it's not always 100%, but basically it's my own design, you know, what I decide that I'm going to do with that painting, especially, you know, if it's just at this point, you know, there's not, how could I say, you know, it's just something that comes so natural. It's so much part of my brain of who I am and so on and so forth, you know, that it just comes up. It just, you know, I wake up in the morning and I have, you know, tons of ideas of things that what I don't have enough is time. Ideas, yes, they're there. Time is a little bit harder.
Yeah. So yeah, so you make your sketch, and
Right.
then you get a model if you need a figure for it or whatever.
That's
you
right.
get, you
That's
get that
right.
reference.
Yeah.
And
So, you know, that's I always work with models, no question about it. And you know, I work from pencil sketch, you know, and then that develops into photographs that I take for the models, and I select, you know, what I need from this, the upper body, you know, from this photograph, the legs from the other, and so on and so forth, and you know, mix it together and make it into the fantasy too. So anyhow, that's basically the process.
I
It's like,
have a question that I'd just love to jump in with if it's okay. And I've just, I'm sure everybody feels the same, that as we scroll through your images, they're absolutely extraordinary. The drawing, the composition, texture, color, concept, it's just absolutely amazing. But I know that, you know, having gone to art school myself, it is not easy to find people who can teach you to paint and draw real, well, drawing may be a little bit more easy, but to paint realistically in the way that you do, in such an extraordinary three-dimensional way. And I wonder if you had a hard time finding those teachers. I know thankfully you had Julie and Boris to teach you, Anthony and Palumbo, Anthony and David to a certain degree, but was that difficult to find those teachers who could help you with those techniques?
I think that that's getting better. I think that the shunning of realism in art schools is less than it was during the later half of the 20th century. It seemed like, I remember when I was in school, Tony and I both went to the same school, which is the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, and they had a very realist, traditionalist academic program. So I think that was kind of why Tony chose that school, I'm assuming, for that reason. And he had been there for 2 years when I started going. And I remember that the instructors we had who had been in school in the 70s and 80s would talk about how that was a real struggle for them. I think we were lucky to be able to go to a school that really focused on foundational things if you're interested in doing realism.
Yeah, we could spend all day, we could fill our schedule with life painting classes, and that was really where I think both of us learned how to handle paint, was twice a day, 3 hours in a room with the model, and you have your fellow students around you learning by watching what they're doing, the people who came into school with more experience already. So being in that small community of an art school was amazing. And yeah, just spending the hours playing with paint and many hours is the main thing. More important than any specific teacher either of us had, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of teachers or pieces of, you know, like moments in lessons that stayed with me, but definitely what Tony just said. And for anyone who's like looking for that kind of a program now, there's atelier programs seem to be the best place to find it, and also a lot more affordable than a university or a kind of, you know, degree type of a program.
Thank you. It sounds like you were in the right place. And Julie and Boris, did you have a similar experience, or?
Well, actually, it's funny that neither one of us ever took an actual painting class from any teacher, except me from Boris. And so, and even with that, I was just watching him paint, you know, but we both studied drawing in school. And, you know, when he was in Peru and he studied art, that's what he did, was drawing from the model. And that's what I did also, was drawing from the model. I did have a couple of teachers in particular that really did, like there was one I remember that had us take drawings, not paintings, but drawings from old masters and try to copy them, you know, kind of verbatim, just like line for line as much as possible, just to understand why did you know, Michelangelo make those lines? Why did he do it that way? And it really was interesting to do that, because it really felt like a private lesson from him, you know, to do those kind of master copies. But drawing from the model, you know, it's just, I don't know how much it has. I'm sure it has a lot to do with what teachers you have, but I think it just really has a lot to do with what your interest is. And if you are as fascinated with, like, I don't know, my visual life is just so big, you know, it's all I do all day is look at things, and I can't help it. But when I'm like having a conversation with somebody, I am just, you know, taken by the texture of their skin or highlights or whatever on their nose or whatever. And it's just, that's where my mind is almost all the time. So I think I'm just constantly kind of doing realistic art in my head all the time. And that's a lot of, how it gets developed, I believe. But I am also glad, one of either Tony or David said the thing about how realism is much more accepted now in school and in the art world in general. And I'm really, really very glad about that, because the more the world knowledge of that is happening and the more I'm seeing online, the more I'm learning as well every single day just by looking at other people's work. So
My whole basic training was actually going to art school when I was 15 years old. I got a scholarship to go to art school, and I studied there for a few years. And there was not really any talk or any teaching of how do you apply, working with models. It was just a matter of learning to draw and just keep in mind, what you're doing. And only when I came to the United States, I actually learned, that you can do something with that experience. You can something with that technique, and use it to advantage, when you do illustration. So that's how it worked for me.
I remember Boris told me a story one time about that he went to, the first time that he went to the Society of Illustrators, they had a show there, and it was in New York City, and he had never seen the professional illustrations, and at that time they were, a lot of them were done with a lot of realism,
Right.
But he had just never seen them in person. And when he did, he had seen things in museums, of course, a lot of art in museums, but he had never seen that. And when he saw it, he actually got sick and he got really depressed for a few days, and he went home and he just felt like, okay, I have to really get way better. But I do think that seeing other people's art that you admire
Absolutely.
in person, if you have that opportunity at all, it really, really makes such a big difference in how you can understand it. It's so different from seeing it printed.
Thank you so much.
I just want to give a quick answer to a question in the chat. Somebody asked, I had talked about Sanu Leon book elsewhere online as being an influence, and they ask other Spanish masters I admire. And Antonio Lopez Garcia is a painter who I remember being exposed to him when I was in school and love his stuff, still do. And what you were just saying, Mom, I remember going to see some of his paintings in person in Boston, and they're enormous. I was just like blown away.
Right.
Seeing them in books for years, to stand in front of like an 8-foot painting is really a different experience. Yeah.
Yeah, when you can get up to a painting and look at it from an angle and see the impasto or lack of impasto, you can really feel more of what it was like for that artist to make those marks. So yeah.
Those specific paintings I remember also because they're so big, and they're these cityscapes of mostly Madrid, I think. And when you look at them in books, they have all this like bizarre kind of curving architecture. When you're standing in front of the painting, it doesn't. It's like it's painted to be experienced live, because your peripheral vision just makes everything straighten out, which it's like, that's so cool.
One thing I really like to do when I'm at a, some place where I see somebody's art that I admire in person, is like pretend that it's on my own easel. And like, I really have to just like go into my imagination and really create this feeling like this is my painting, and I'm holding my paintbrush and I'm about to paint on it. Of course, I don't do that because I don't want to get kicked out, but anyway, but I remember doing that like with a Bouguereau painting once, and it was just so cool because it makes you see like, what did he choose that you wouldn't have chosen? And, how did he think about whatever, the edges or the values or the, the way the colors are so harmonious or whatever. And it just really, that kind of little mental exercise has really helped me a lot whenever I do have that opportunity to see someone's artwork in real life.
Terrific. Yeah, I'd like to share an image here of David, your piece in the exhibit, and if you could talk about it briefly.
Yeah, so this was commissioned by Sideshow Collectibles, and this is slightly different from the version that was printed by them. But they had been doing, I believe still are doing, this whole line of characters and stories called Court of the Dead. And for a while, I just had this kind of situation with them where they would just email me like a character, you know, here's what they look like, here's their story, make a piece. And they weren't really for any particular application. I think they were planning to maybe do an art book, maybe do some prints or something. And this one, the character was supposed to be this kind of, you know, I think she was like a, you know, goddess of battle or something like that. And the man who was kind of in charge of the project and I both, I guess, had been talking about World War I don't remember the particulars, but I think it was his suggestion that he wanted to see her on this kind of World War I battlefield, which seemed interesting to me. And the only difference between this and the print is there's a lot of digital, like glowing magic and things like that added. But I kind of felt for the painting that I wanted to exist as a finished piece, the magic was a little over the top. I wanted it to be a little more kind of low key than that. I saw this, somebody sent a photo of it next to a Doré painting, am I right?
That was me.
Which I'm like, oh, way to make me look bad. Who can stand up next to that?
No, I thought it was
amazing Doré piece.
I thought it was such a great coincidence. So in the exhibit, your piece is next to the Doré.
I took it as like a great compliment and also a humbling experience.
David, it's such a cool painting. And one thing about that painting that you would have to see the painting in person to know is how it's pretty big.
Well, this is the thing. So yeah, there's lots of, I'm really proud of that piece, but you see it next to the Doré piece and it looks tiny.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and I realized that came off a little sharp the way I said it. I was thrilled to see that, but it really was just like, oh man, it's like there's these people that you look at their work. I remember seeing the Enigma, which is a Doré piece that's hanging in Musée d'Orsay, I think.
Yeah.
And just being like, you know, I'm gonna be here for a little while and just kind of absorb this. And I think that was influential in the painting that you have hanging in the show there.
Mm-hmm.
We have to go. I mean, we have to go to the show. I don't mean we have to go. Sorry.
All right.
We have to go to the show and see it. Sorry. Wrong cue.
Let's see here, Julie. So this is your work in the exhibition, Pegasus Among the Muses. Could you talk about this a little bit?
When I don't remember my initial thought of why I did it, honestly, but what I started thinking was I want to do something just really big. This painting is 4 by 5, and at the time it was the first one that I had done, you know, just for I'd done a painting of some horses that was at that size, but I wanted to do I decided, I felt like I really wanted to do a fantasy painting that's treated, you know, with everything I have as far as like, to think of it as like fine art, but this is fantasy. And I'm like, I just want to just paint the hell out of Pegasus, really, and just make it really splashy and cool. And I was thinking, like, we had been in Venice recently, and I wanted to use colors that reminded me of Venice, and just make it feel like this would be something that you would have seen on a ceiling or a wall or something there. You know, they have these gigantic paintings there that are like as big as buildings. They're so huge. But anyway, I was very influenced by that feeling of being there with these really large paintings. And so I just wanted to do something that really was big. And I always loved Pegasus. And I just felt like, you know, doing something with these kind of textures with the way the fabric is there, the satins and that kind of thing. And then have the creature be, you know, we can't really understand exactly how he's formed, but we know that this dragon is a dragon. And then make the woman, you know, and the horse very realistic, so that you're kind of grounded in a certain amount of reality. But I just really wanted to do something that to me felt like it was a big grand thing with fantasy and like classic fantasy, you know.
Yes, and seeing this in person, it has a very three-dimensional effect. I know the green silk there in the front, you look at it and it just looks like it's coming out of the painting.
I like to do this cool trick where you make like a little tunnel with your hands, like a telescope, and you just look through, you close the other eye, and so you just look through your telescope at a painting, and you cover up the edges, and it comes into 3D. And when I'm working, I'll do that a lot, and it makes me see areas that do need to be brought more into 3D that way.
Mhm.
It's really fun, like that.
Terrific. When you guys get together, do you talk about art, or do you keep business out of it?
Oh, no. We talk about art all the time. I mean, it's not the only thing that we talk about, of course,
Sure.
but we do talk about always, about art, something, one thing or another.
Mhm.
So it's just like it's part of our lives, of a very strong part of who we are.
Yep.
Yeah, it's either talking about what our own projects are, or something like we just saw a new Greg Manchester Donato piece and talking about that with people, with our
Right.
little group.
All right, I want to share one image. It's by Boris and Julie. So I know you occasionally collaborate on works. I believe it's John Carter, correct?
Right. Yep.
So yeah, how do you work together?
We are together all the time.
No, how do we work together?
I know, but I was going to say, we really, our thinking is very similar.
Yeah.
So we don't even really have to communicate with each other, what we want or what we think it should be. Very seldom, we just, realistically and truly, we just take one part of the painting, whatever part it is, and start working at it. And then when we get to a certain point, the next one takes over, and so on. And we shift and we decide who is going to be working what. It's just up to the specific artist.
Yeah,
So-
and like each individual painting, sometimes it's like people always ask, how do you decide who does what? And it really is determined differently on different paintings.
Exactly.
And it might have to do with something as practical as just time. It may be that this person is more booked up with their other work and they can't really do as much on it right now, and so whatever. But sometimes there'll be something like, well, I think that Boris should do the drawing on this part, and then I'll do the the painting on that part, or whatever, or the other way around. It really just kind of depends on the needs of each painting, or just more practical needs. But sometimes we actually forget who did what, because it doesn't matter if it's a collaboration.
We don't really start painting, immediately. We develop a sketch, together,
Yeah,
and then when we have the sketch really, established,
right.
then whoever feels like doing what, does it, and that's
Yeah.
that.
Sorry to give such a mysterious answer,
Right.
but it's not really like there is a clear process that goes on all the time.
We have a really, really amazing communication with each other, so no problem.
Yeah. Terrific. We have just a couple of minutes left, so I wondered if each of you could just talk a little bit about your current projects or what you have planned for the future. Anthony?
Right now, I'm sorry, transitioning from. I had a period where, like, my main jobs right now are working as a freelance concept artist for video game studios, and so that I like that could be a long-term project that could go for years with one studio, and so I was doing that for a couple of years, and then the studio closed all of a sudden, which is a thing that happens all the time in the game industry. And so I took a year off where I just worked on personal projects I wanted to develop. And then about 6 months ago, I started up again with another studio. And so right now my focus is working on this big collaborative project, which is really fun. It's really interesting to change from working solo in the studio, like David and my mom and Boris do, to suddenly every day you're sharing with the other artists, even though we now are doing it via Zoom, like So yeah, right now working on that, and one day when that job's done, I'll get back to more personal work.
Terrific. David?
So I also had a bit of a downtime period coming off. I had finished a whole Marvel Masterpiece set last year, and there was a period of time after that. It was 135 paintings, which is the most like single group of work for a single project I'd ever done.
Wow.
And I was just like, I'll probably need a couple weeks and then I'll be back into it. And then like a few months later, it's just like, woo, still kind of like catching my breath. And then yeah, similarly to Tony, I guess it was about 6 months ago, all of a sudden a bunch of different illustrated book projects came in. And so that's been kind of filling up my year. So I'm doing 4 different illustrated novels right now, I think. I don't think I can give too much info on any of them particularly, but they span everything from like, you know, books that are almost 100 years old to books that'll be published for the first time, which is really exciting. So.
And then Boris and Julie, what do you have going on?
We are always, you know, we have our calendar that we do every year. So we're always producing for that, which is really an awesome project to collaborate. I mean, we always do like, usually we'll do like 6 paintings each individually and 1 painting as a collaboration. It can change sometimes, but anyway, that's always a great thing to have going on because we get to do pretty much what we want to do within a certain world of what they expect in the calendar world. But we have mostly, we have a few commissions that are not private commissions that are more like corporate things, but mostly we have private commissions these days instead of more, you know, book covers and things like that. I do have one client that's given me a lot of book covers to do, and I'm doing those as they come along. But the private commissions are really fun because there's a lot of people that want to have portraits of themselves as fantasy. Yeah. So that's super fun, and they like the joy that they get out of it is just so great. I love doing those fantasy portraits. And aside from that, for me, I am also making a children's book that I've written, and I've got most of the illustrations done for it. I'm finally getting around to that children's book that I always wanted to do. You know, and my own personal work, sometimes I just feel like I just have to paint a wolf right now. I just have to. I just feel I've got to have some wolf in me today. So those things happen.
And Boris, how about you?
The private commissions is mostly where you're at.
Yeah, I would say, you know, private commissions for the most part. And we have, of course, as Julie mentioned, you know, the calendar that comes out every year. I think we have done something like 40 years so far.
Yeah.
And it's really, really fun because we know what we want to do. We know what our client wants to do, you know, and we just do it. And it's really fabulous, you know, to be able to do so much and to be able to do it just your way. And what else can you ask for?
Terrific. Well, that's all the time we have, but I thank you guys all so much for your contributions to the show and for participating in this morning's talk. I love your work. You're such amazing artists and such terrific people.
Well,
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
for
inviting
much.
us. Really.
Thanks for hosting this. And
Yeah, we're so happy to be here.
yeah.
Sincere